Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Navigate Sales Objections and Negotiations for Win-Win Outcomes. I'm Chip St. Clair, Vice President of Content Strategy and Communications here at Tyson Group, and I'll be moderating today's session. So drop a note in the chat and let us know where you're joining from. We'd like to see, because we have lots of registrants for this one. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all registrants will receive a recording of this webinar within the next few days. We want to make this session interactive, so please submit your questions using the chat or Q&A feature. I'll make sure we get to as many as possible. And then at the end of the webinar, we're also going to share some resources to help you continue building your negotiation and sales effectiveness capabilities. So make sure you stay till the end. In today's session, we're going to break down how top performing sales teams approach negotiations differently, not as a reactive event, but as a structured part of the sales process that protects value and improves outcomes. Now, I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Joining us is Dr. Adam Rapp, Tyson Group's Vice President of Research Integration and a leading authority on sales effectiveness. Dr. Rapp also serves as the Chaired Professor of Marketing at Ohio University and is globally recognized for his contributions to sales research, ranking number 5 lifetime and number 3 worldwide over the past 5 years. His work is focused on translating rigorous research into practical strategies that organizations can apply to improve performance. Welcome, Dr. Rapp.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Lance Tyson, President and CEO of Tyson Group. Lance leads an award-winning sales training and consulting firm, 3-time Inc. 5000 honoree, and is widely recognized for his expertise in data-driven sales performance. As a #1 Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author and trusted advisor to some of the world's most respected brands, Lance has spent decades helping organizations improve execution, strengthen sales teams, and drive consistent revenue growth. Welcome, Lance. With that, take it away.
All right, Chip, I appreciate it. I'm always, you read my bio sometimes and I have to think, is that me? So, Dr. Rapp, back from Vegas. Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you, Lance. Great to be here.
So got a shout out to a couple of customers. I know we got a big crew from Legends on here with the Browns project. Also, I think a big crew from Dave & Buster's. So thanks for being on, and a bunch of others. So I think today's topic's interesting. That's why the attendance got so high, is because we're literally in a debate constantly with our customers about, one is navigating objections. When do they happen? A lot of times we're constantly asking, when we wrote this, Dr. Rapp, was, well, what's the difference between objection and negotiation? And a lot of salespeople, a lot of sales leaders literally look at them as synonyms, and they're not. They're very different concepts. And if you invoke one before the other, since you were in Vegas, you lower your odds a little bit, and you're playing a slot game, and you are not playing a game of craps. And that's what we're looking for, better odds, right?
That's it, man.
I appreciate it. All right. So in typical fashion, I am going to start off with a question, right? When you're selling, right, what's the difference between resolving an objection and a negotiation? And the goal is to knock down that question today. So as you're sitting there taking some notes or half watching YouTube in the news cycle, that is the question. So our goal today is to not only give you some macro views of this, but also some tactics. If you're a leader, let's think about the strategy. If you're in sales, what can you do to get those better odds? So my first rule in negotiation, Dr. Rapp, anybody we talk to, is like, first of all, negotiation is not an argument. It's not a fight. We seek some sort of win-win. Even one of my competitors, Chris Voss, who talks about never splitting the difference. I was on a podcast with him one time, and I said, I don't know if you could actually negotiate without splitting the difference. I think that's what it comes down to all the time. So you gotta continue to express your dissent, is what this rule says, and you got to remain civilized, because it's not an argument, right? Because once you become uncivilized, you'll sacrifice everything, and you'll really long for it. So Dr. Rapp and I thought #1 is when you look at sales negotiations and objections, really, what's the difference, right? Dr. Rapp, what's your first comment on both these concepts before we dive into these definitions?
Sure. So, Lance, first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for joining today. Excited to talk about this. This is something that we all deal with in our sales life and regular life as a buyer, as a seller. I mean, negotiations are just it's a part of life and everything we do. So we have to get comfortable with it. You've already hit some key points here. And the first one, before I talk about the definitions, is you got to take the emotion and you got to put it in your pocket. Right? You can't get frustrated. You can't get angry. You can't get overly excited. You have to remain neutral on these things because what we have to understand is, as I said, this is all part of it. Obviously, we would all love to go into a sales call and just have people buy immediately, but it doesn't work that way, at least not for me. There's always going to be some pushback. There's going to be some questions. There's going to be some challenges, right? And so we have to address those. So the first thing we take a look at is objections and negotiations are different things, right? We all can see the definition here, but an objection is it's a request for more information. It's the idea that we haven't been clear. There's still some confusion that exists out there. Negotiation is the idea that, hey, we're moving this thing forward. Now we're getting aligned on what the value is and how we get this deal done. But these are separate entities. And a
Yep,
lot of times people will look at his objection as a trigger to start negotiating. And
that's right.
that is completely wrong because if that's how you look at an objection is, oh, I'm going to start negotiating now, the first thing we see people give is price and say, oh, in order to address this objection, I'm just going to lower my price. Where over half the time, and you look at research that exists out there, over half the time, it's not a price objection. It's like, I don't understand why, help me understand the value of this. We immediately start lowering this price. So sorry, I got a little excited there on that when I said
No, no,
emotional, but
it's so
yeah,
true. I mean, your economic objections are what we work on with our clients, and this, our joint clients is any kind of economic objection is cost, value, price, or budget. It manifests itself under one of those
yep,
buckets. By the way, they're all three different things. You wouldn't have cost unless you bought something. I don't have insurance on a car unless I bought a car. Um, price, price is the price. Price is what the market will bear. The marketplace is an uncanny way of getting rid of things that don't work. Value is perceived, and budget is a planning process, whether it's B2C or B2B, right? And what's kind of interesting too is if you're listening today, I'd probably write three things down. Do I know the difference between a buying signal and a warning signal? Because they're the early factors that dictate objections. Hint, a buying signal is anything the buyer says or does or doesn't say or doesn't do that indicates some level of hesitation. And a warning signal is anything the buyer says or does or doesn't say or doesn't do that indicates some level of, or excuse me, a buying signal is anything a buyer says or does or doesn't say or doesn't do that indicates some level of interest. And a warning signal is anything a buyer says or does or doesn't say or do that indicates some level of hesitation. So an objection then is actually the expression of I don't like this. This isn't going to work. I don't like the price, like you said. I don't like the terms. I don't think the solution meets my needs or addresses the opportunity. And then a negotiation, if you think about it, if you looked up in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, went online to dictionary.com, there's like four different definitions for negotiation. I think the third one says to navigate around, through, or over something. Most of you, if you drove your car into work today, navigated your car down the highway or into a parking place. So it's the act of navigating. But objections, like at the bottom here, an objection always comes before you start negotiating. Because, like you said, Dr. Rapp, if you hear a price and you just trigger, hey, I'm going to lower my guard
yep,
or lower my price, you've actually dropped into bargaining.
yeah,
You went into a different section. And write this down. You can't bargain if you're blind. So if you just trigger off start bargaining right away, you get kind of have an issue to begin with. So that's how we bucket things. Now, as we move forward, one of the things that you got to think about is are you considering the buying funnel? And it doesn't matter if it's B2C or B2B, but Dr. Rapp, if we're going to buy something or make an investment in something I have experience with that I need it, I'm going to buy a new landscaper, I'm going to buy an entertainment package to go to D&B from maybe a corporate event, they have to recognize there is an opportunity or there is a need, right? Then they're going to go seek information. They're going to analyze the information, make a purchase decision, and then you have your post sale. But your next thing is your actually your funnel to sell with. That funnel should line a little bit up with that buying funnel. So for all of you, when you're prospecting, you're making initial contact, and somebody says, "I'm not interested in meeting with you," that's not an objection. So, and if you're a leader on here, stop letting your salespeople call it an objection because it's not. That's preoccupation. That's I'm not interested in. You didn't say anything got my attention, right? You don't really get a true buying objection to after you actually present something to somebody, right? And then only after that, if you looked at this map, is when you would negotiation. You would negotiate. Dr. Wright, what are some of your comments on this as we start to
Yeah,
get into some of our
so there's a
data?
couple things, right, Lance? First of all, like today is all about reducing uncertainty. Okay, that's just today, the whole conversation today is about. And we're trying to protect the deal value when it comes down to it. Now, when we look at this, and this is, I think this is important to consider. When you look at how we buy as humans, right? And we go through this and we make a decision that we need something and we set our criteria and we investigate and we go through this process, we do it again and again and again. You have never thought like you have never broken those pieces out with intent. Like when you decide your cell phone's broken, it's like I need a new cell phone. You don't go through, okay, the next thing I need to do is make the decision to buy. The next thing I need to do is set my criteria. We just do that. And the whole process is holistic, right? From start to
Yes,
finish
right, right.
from and this matters because from the minute your cell phone breaks, you're like, oh geez, I think I want to do this, I want to get that, and you're putting all of this together in one complete package. But when it comes to selling, we break everything down to these steps, which is fine to learn it. But what we need to understand is from the very first step, to your point, when I reach out to somebody, my first contact, my cold contact, whatever it is, from that very first conversation, I'm adding value. I need to think about the entire sales interaction rather than like, ooh, what do I do next? Ooh, I ask questions. What do I do next? I present feature. No, because the more value, and we'll talk about this more in a few slides, if I can be presenting value, if I can be reducing uncertainty from the very beginning of the interaction the whole way through, then all of a sudden this, this section of objections or this section of negotiations they start to blend in and they start to go away because we're addressing this holistically, just the way we buy, is we think
That's
about
right.
everything. So from a sales standpoint, we need to match these things up rather than like, oh, okay, at what point do I deal with objections? Well, I mean, hopefully never, but they can show up anywhere. So we want to try to deal with them as early on as we can.
Well, and I think we got one question, and I'll kind of address it because you kind of teed it up. So if you go to the left, if you're here and you say, all right, and it's easy for salespeople to think in a linear fashion,
Yep.
right? So if I part of my job have to cold prospect, identify targets, and I have to reach out to them. That's a solicited buy. If you work in a car lot or like if you worked at Best Buy at the Apple section, when somebody walks in, that's an unsolicited buy. So they're already in the buying cycle. So if you were selling iPads at Best Buy or the Apple store, somebody walks in, that buyer's already met it, knows there's an opportunity. You got to meet them where you are. If you're prospecting, you got to target and do things to get them interested. So if they say, hey, I'm not if I'm working for the Browns or if I'm working for Dave and Buster's and I make cold outreach or I'm working for a professional services organization, say I'm not interested. Of course you're not interested. I don't know if you've thought of X, so I'm going to bring some value to the table. Have you thought that if you spend X amount of dollars in saying thank you to good employees, you may actually affect keeping those employees? So I got to say something that starts them to get them to recognize an opportunity. Of course, if you call somebody cold, they're going to say, I'm not interested. That's not objection, though. You would not get an objection until you actually presented them a solution or and that comes off of asking questions, right? So you giving them a prescription before there's a diagnosis, that's malpractice. So you got to then sell the fact that you got to talk to them and dive in a little bit, right? So I hope that starts to make sense, and we're going to dive deeper into this as we go ahead. Now I'm going to share some data for you. We have we look at sales through a lens called sales team science. Last year we ran about 1,000 salespeople through our lens sales team science, 300 leaders, and about 35 different companies. Here's what's really interesting. When we looked at the reps and leaders in alignment, if you went to, and this is what phase of the sales process do you experience most difficulty? Well, the leaders, about 18% of them said it's probably in objections, managing objections. And then it dropped off from there. Then the salespeople said, well, for almost 15% of the time, I'm experiencing problems in negotiation. And then the leaders said, nah, it's about half of that. If you just looked at those two things, we know in most cases that if you're a leader on this phone, do you have different processes that your salespeople can fall back on to resolve an objection? And do you have a formal sales process to negotiate? Or are you blending them both together? Because they're two different strategies. And it's not as easy as us just giving you a one-word answer, an analogy, or a simile or a metaphor. They're two different sales and we actually have a whole program built on negotiation, and we're gonna share a model for that for negotiation at the end of today. So we know that most sales leaders and salespeople, based off our research, are just out of alignment on both processes. What are some of your comments on that, Dr. Rapp?
Yeah, so here's my take on it, right? And this goes back to my earlier point is if you combine for the reps, if you combine your objections and negotiations, you're looking at what, 35%, right, of the people who say that's where they face their biggest challenges. The thing is if we're addressing these earlier, these steps, like the prospecting, qualifying, the questioning, presenting value, if we do a better job with those earlier on, then we can reduce these numbers on the back end. Right.
That's right.
And that's my big takeaway because personally, I know when I sell and I sell corporate partnerships, I sell for Tyson Group, right? I know if I'm getting hammered at the back end and I'm just getting objection, then I know immediately I'm like, I did a bad job presenting value. Right. And that falls on me because if a customer keeps coming back and says, I don't understand why price is so high. I don't understand the delivery. I don't understand how to work with you. Could you explain? If they keep coming at me with this, then I'm like, okay, I didn't do a good job earlier on, whether it be from the qualification. Maybe I did a bad job asking questions to uncover some of these issues earlier on. Because sometimes we mistake a customer if they're quiet early in the presentation. We're like, ooh, they're totally into this because they're not saying anything. And so we push through to get to the end. Whereas realistically, we need to be engaging them to pull some of this stuff out earlier on to make this end of the call easier.
Well, and I think if you go back to one of the things we were saying earlier, and you really set that up nice. One, if you don't have a working definition for buying signals and warning signals, you're going to misinterpret things that happen in the sales process, right? So if anybody here is fortunate enough to sell face to face or via some kind of sales enablement tool like this, you can misread somebody's body language. Like, see me rubbing my face right now. You might actually think that that's me being interested. I would actually probably for me it's I need a shave, right? You could have somebody silence for being interested, but they might be in complete disagreement. So buying signals, anything they do that indicates interest, warning signals, anything they do that indicate disinterest. If you're just using the observation method to do that and not asking or challenging at some level, you got about an issue. Your worst time or your lowest odds to resolve an objection are when the buyer brings it up on their terms. You have higher odds of resolving an objection if you bake your common objection into your presentation.
Yep.
You should be talking to your objections because I'm not saying they won't come up and they will go away, but you'll dull the blade. If the objection was a blade on an axe, you dull the blade, right? And another option with objections also for all of you is to flat out ignore the objection to see if it actually comes up again. That is an option at some level, but you got to run it through the filter of the sales process. So the best time to deal with an objection is before it comes up. The second best time is to ask for the objection. The worst time to deal with an objection is they bring it up without anything from you. So let's start looking at some more data. So Dr. Rapp, talk about us through the sales cycle phases, needs versus cost versus
Sure.
solution risk, and
Yeah,
how
yeah.
things
So
come
let's
out.
so let's just so let's think about this for a second. This is one of my absolute favorite slides. It's one of my favorite ways to present how we miss as salespeople. So if we think about the buying process, so when we engage with a prospect and we start talking to them, right, that initial conversation is, if we look on the left-hand side, there's four things that prospect is thinking about. the risk, and risk varies. Like solution, like what all can you do for me? What is your cost? And then needs. When we first start talking to somebody, it's about can we meet their needs or not? I mean, that's the first fundamental part because it's not price out of the gate because people walk into a conversation, they have a range. Like they have a certain amount. And as long as we're within that range, price isn't the most important thing. For example, if I'm going to buy a car and I have a certain price range and I don't want to go over 50,000, I'm probably not going to the Mercedes lot. But I've got a range on what I'm willing to spend, but there's a certain need. I have two children, I need four doors, I need all-wheel drive. Now, here's the thing. Once we meet the needs as a salesperson, once we check that box, the conversation has to evolve. And this is where we miss oftentimes in sales. So if you click on it, what we see next is it's this solution. So if I'm looking for a car with four doors and all-wheel drive, hypothetically, those are my two needs. Once we check that box, if that salesperson just keeps badgering on that again and again and again, or if they try to immediately move to the close because they met my needs, they're missing that opportunity in the middle of what else do you have to offer? What other value? Because when we start talking about value, and that's where decisions are made, what else can increase that value? Because now maybe we start talking about, well, the fuel economy, the gas mileage, the leather seats, the all of these extra things that start to increase my overall package and value. By doing that, what we're doing, because we know that value equals quality divided by price. If I'm increasing quality and increasing quality and increasing quality, then my value is increasing. I don't need to adjust my price. But if I go in and only talk about the need that you have and then try to push it to the end, so go ahead and push it to the next one, Lance. And if I jump to the end, that's when that risk emerges. That's when we get that sense of
Well
not
said.
buyer's remorse yet, but the let me think about it, I'm not sure. The more I can present in the middle, right? The more I reduce risk at the end. And I'm not going to say it's going to go away completely, but this is where objections emerge. They're just a function of risk.
Are you saying at some level that the way a salesperson sells, the experience the buyer has with the salesperson, that they actually create objections?
100, they absolutely can. Absolutely.
I think so too. I
Yeah.
think usually it goes to something that wasn't presented that was too general, like you're saying here, exactly what they're saying, and that or jumping completely to the close. We're dealing with an employee benefit broker that sells corporate insurance in the Midwest and Chicago. And many times when they call on a business like ours, they're selling to the org chart, a president, a CRO, or excuse me, a CFO, and maybe somebody in HR. And a lot of the reps, as soon as they hear a problem, they jump right to presenting something, yet they didn't spend any time into how the buyer had gotten to that point, how many years they've done business with their current broker, and they ask for the business. And that seems risky too. The other thing is they kind of say their baby's ugly because they have put no time into thinking about how long it took to build that and what the relationships were. So the real move is to slow play it. They actually become risky because they go too far to solving the need before evaluating alternatives. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? Right? And then looking at the risk and reducing it. It's probably the most powerful slide in the presentation.
I think, and I'm going to stick on this for 1 second, Lance. In my other life, working at the sales program here at Ohio University, people come to me for one thing. They come to hire sales students, right? Professional salespeople. Obviously I check that box because I work at a university graduating sales students. But the thing is if I stop there, now I'm competing with, there's people on the call from other sales programs right now. We're competing all on the same playing field. But if I can start adding how easy it is to work with this, virtual options across, and if I just keep stacking that value up, that's A, where we beat the competition, and also B, we start to reduce that and mitigate that risk.
And what's so interesting, we forget as salespeople, values perceived. You're not going to
Yes.
dictate to somebody what they value. You have to determine what they value and then present to what they value, not just need, because it's need versus want. And I'd write this down. It's a sales song. What do they want and why do they want it? That gets the value. The what might address the need, the why addresses the value, right? So as Dr. Rep, we obviously, based off your creation, the what we do at Tyson Group now, we look at a ton of data in our sales competency assessment. For the leaders here and for the salespeople, talk a little bit about what we're seeing here on these knowledge points.
Yeah, so we've surveyed, upwards of 2,000 sales reps now and leaders. And this is just a screenshot of the top half of one of the assessments, and obviously it's blinded on who responded. But this is self-report data, this first part, and it just talks about how long it took them and how they self-rate performance. But the big takeaway and what we tell managers and organizational leaders is when somebody rates themselves on their weakest step and their least favorite step, they always ask, well, why does that matter? And, well, let me ask, Lance. I mean, if you go to the gym, like, what exercise are you going to skip? Like the one you're probably weakest at, and the one that you don't like. Like that's
Never,
why.
never skip leg day.
Well, that's why everybody skips leg day, right?
Everybody
It's
skips
because
leg day.
it's hard and we don't like it, and we avoid. Oftentimes, we avoid things we don't like because many salespeople are performance oriented, like they want to be successful, which is wonderful. So we avoid areas we're weak. What we're finding is over 50% of our respondents rate negotiation and handling objections as their strongest weakness or their least favorite step. Over half. So if that's the case, then they're avoiding this and they just don't want to engage in it, or they're just not good at it because you have to get practice, you have to get some repetitions in. And the thing is, we know they're going to show up, we know we're going to see them. So we have to make sure that we're getting that muscle memory and that repetition in. But oftentimes we're trying to ignore that. And because of that, we're struggling a little bit. And I think we saw it to some extent on those earlier slides with the data as well.
It's kind of interesting. Chip in the chat asked a question: How confident is your team? And it kind of ties into this comment, Dr. Rapp. How confident is your team in distinguishing between objection and negotiation? I think five people or six people answered B, somewhat confident. And that kind of plays into the data points we're seeing. Number one is if you notice the words Dr. Rapp and I used, and it's been on purpose today, in one part of the earlier part of the presentation, and when you saw that bar chart coming horizontally, we talked about managing objections. Dr. Rapp just said handling objections, and at another point I said resolve objections. And that you got to triangulate around those three things because one, most salespeople struggle, and leaders comment on this because they don't actually have a process to deal with objection. At best, we go into some of the best organizations. They go, "Hey, these are typical marketplace-driven objections," and they usually tie around price, value, cost, budget, and it's usually some kind of economic factor, right? Then when we go deeper in our studies and we say, all right, lay out the objection handling process or the resolving objections process. Most of the time we get people describing what they do in that situation. Most leaders can't lay out the process, right? They don't lay it out. And that process is built into four factors. One is one is smoking out objection. So is it this or that, right? Then categorizing the objection into something. Is this a put off? Is this half baked? Is this flat out credibility? Is this just true and we can't deal with it? And then three is the resolution, and then four would be the close to it. They can't lay out the process. They can just talk about characteristics. And then when we talk to them about objections, we just work with the manufacturing company, a plastics manufacturer in Cleveland. It was owned by private equity. It had grown double digits this year. When we asked them to lay out the negotiation process, they told us who negotiated on the team. It was the two principals. Then they told us what the characteristics were for a good negotiator inside the plastics industry. And I think I said, you worked on that too. I think I said, well, that sounds like a good negotiator freaking in any business. And when I laid it out to them, they couldn't describe the step-by-step process in which they negotiated. So I said, then you have to put a good negotiator in every time because you don't have a process, because you have characteristics to objections and negotiations of who you need to be. And most of us are probably good negotiators, and then or deal with objections. And then what's the process? Predictable process yields predictable result. And that's actually what the next thing says. So as you look at selling skill proficiency, Dr. Rapp, back based on the last slide, what else are we saying?
So we start to look at some of these gaps, and what this is showing is how reps think how good they are at dealing with objections versus what their leaders think. Let's be clear, we're overconfident in this, right? Most of the time, reps are over 50% are reporting that they're not that good at it. It's their least favorite thing. But when it comes to how confident, like, oh, sure, I can handle that. And their leaders are saying, no, no, you can't, right? We're not doing a good
Yeah.
job. And the larger that gap is, the more problematic it is because oftentimes it becomes a blind spot or a facade. The idea that they don't realize they're not good at dealing with it, or they try to compensate in other areas to make up for it and ignore it. And that starts to become problematic. We know that when we're not good at this, right, we'll start to make concessions in other areas. And the first concession we make always goes to price. Is the easiest way for me to deal with this is just lower price. But again, that objection isn't always tied to that negotiation. That objection is a chance to clarify and get alignment on value before moving forward to that next step.
Yeah, and I think the reason, and we talked a little bit about this, I think a lot of salespeople act very confident as it relates to objections because, how are you confident? Well, if you want to be confident, just act confident. There's also a recency effect to that. They look at the last deal they did and said, I resolved that objection or I made that sale, so I must have resolved the objection. And I think a lot of you got to think about how many deals have you thought you lost that came back to you that you ended up winning, and you go, I don't have no clue why I got that back, but I got it. The question is, did you really resolve the objection, or did they go away and resolve it themselves, and you just weren't included? And how many deals do you think you were going to have that you didn't get that walked away that you were almost 100% sure of? And I think that has to do with is you're not resolving the objection the way you need to. And two, for most of you on the call here today, there's a lot of words in sales that are confusing. Most of you, if I ask most of you this question, what's sales all about? Most of you would say relationships. And that couldn't be any more BS than anything. Relationships are outcomes. It's not a driver. You build rapport. You don't do relationships. And I think a lot of times because that word's so thrown around, I didn't say dealing with people wasn't important. So let's make sure if you never heard me before, go pick my book up. I said rapport and credibility are important. Understanding the buyer is important. What I'm saying is we put too much into the word relationship, and then we think a sale is frictionless. No, a sale has a lot of friction in it, a ton of friction. You got to go through the objection in order to make the sale. So that's where this comes from, right? So let's take a step forward and look at some more. So reasons why salespeople mishandle an objection. I'm going to hand this back over to you, Dr. Rapp.
Okay. The number one thing from what I've seen and from research, even research outside of Tyson Group, coming out of Gartner and that, salespeople don't ask enough questions, right? When they get the objection, the first thing is we have to clarify it. We have to understand it. We can't be afraid of it. We can't run away from it. We can't give in to it. Help me understand. Could you explain? Give me some more information. The objection is emerging from somewhere, right? Let's get to the root of the problem because a lot of times it is a latent objection. And what I mean by that is I can't deal with this, with what is on the surface. So when they say, well, and I see it in the chat, it's like, we already have somebody for that. Okay, I can't address that, but like, let's dig into that a little bit. So let's talk about that. Like, are you happy? Are you satisfied? Is there anything you could change about that current vendor relationship that you have? Dig into that a little bit to see if we can drive that wedge in there and see. If somebody brings up the price, then dig into it. Like, what is it about the price? Because price can mean I don't have the budget right now. Price could mean it's controlled by somebody else. Price could mean that it's too expensive. There's so many different pieces
Well,
there.
it's even
So
even
yeah,
there too. That something real simple there, Rap, is
yeah.
that if you go back to those common economic objections, value, cost, price, budget. And if you said to me, "Hey, I'm really concerned about the price," and I say, "Hey, just curious, is it more price or more your budget?" And because a lot of times people use those words interchangeably and they clearly have different definitions. I think that's so critical. That clarification yields your ability to smoke out and box in what you're dealing with. How many times have you all played whack-a-mole with an objection where they've said one thing, you thought you dealt with it,
Yep.
and then one other pops up because that you're not doing what Dr. Rep's saying is that clarification process. And for you leaders out there is a smoke out process. There's a way to teach salespeople to make sure they corner before they even respond. Most of your salespeople, as soon as somebody says price, they go, yeah, but, and they move into the compelling reason to move forward. Don't clarify, right? So continue, Dr. Rep. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, no, that's fine. So, the other thing is, and we take a look at some of the bullet points on the slide, is number one, we get back to the emotional piece. Sometimes we feel like we're being challenged, we get a little defensive.
Mhm.
Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't like the saying that objections are opportunities because honestly, I would rather have no objections.
That's
But
right.
here's the thing. If my choices are either I get objections or the person walks away and doesn't say anything and doesn't buy, give me the objection. Help me understand like what I didn't do well in my presentation. What am I missing?
That's
And
right.
so when somebody says that to me, here's my chance to dig in and present some value. Now, there's a chance that they're correct. There's a chance that, yes, the competitor has me beat on something. Well, then I'm going to either compensate or I'm going to use something else as an add-on to say, yes, my sales program, for example, we're not the cheapest out there. And let me be clear, I don't want to be the Walmart of sales programs. So if somebody brings up, well, you're more expensive than X, Y, and Z, yes, let me explain why, right? So don't get the emotional part, and sometimes we do that. We have to use more, effective questioning, and we have to understand that objections are a different element than negotiation.
That's
And the
right.
last point, Lance, it's not on here, but I don't think we do enough on preparing for these. Because when it comes down to it, in most organizations I've worked with, and same with you, right? Quite a few, there is not an infinite amount of objections. You've listed out three or four categories today, three or four times. I mean, if we break it down, if we get a list of 10 or 12 objections, sure, there can be more than that, but they're the most common ones. And we
That's
see it
right.
again and again and again. And when I work with a salesperson and they say they get caught off guard because they threw a price objection, then I immediately tell that sales rep, you weren't prepared.
Yeah, how could you be caught off
Yeah.
guard? I mean, it's really you get the objections you get or get that's why those categories become so
Yeah.
important. You're just getting a variation of the same thing at all times, right?
Yep. Yep.
And it's like something else you said too. I was we're working with a media team out of Washington, D.C. that works with a a big sports channel and also is tied into some a venue. And one of the salespeople, as we were doing a dry run, and then I was listening to the call, the salesperson, the I think the buyer said something to the fact that, I'm really concerned about this investment. And then the salesperson just kind of pushed back a little bit and said, hey, let me do the math for you, explaining why the investment was. And I was sitting beside him and I said, yo, why don't you just ask him this? If the investment's a concern, what are some of the other concerns other than investment? And then we'll come back to that. Why don't you isolate down on it? And he asked that question, and then the person said, it's really not as much the investment, it's more kind of the terms you're asking for and the numbers we're going to get. And I looked at him, I go, dude, that's not even, it wasn't even, you were blind there and you're doing the long math for them. Why don't you ask three or four clarifying questions? What else? And then in addition to that, what else? Sometimes that's all you need, right? And then you can categorize it, but you're so right. You can't literally think there's that many combinations. Now, tone and how they deliver it. Another thing for all of you, just kind of a little hack here. Our strong advice from Tyson Group is do not resolve objections in writing. The first rule of negotiation is put nothing in writing. You're summarizing what you did. That calls for a conversation, regardless of what business you're in, right? We're just working with an NFL team, and they have a down in the north or in the northeast, and they had this big events business before one of they have an events business, and before one of their games, the salesperson had set a six-figure proposal over, and the person pushed back a little bit. And I looked at it, I go, why don't you just pick up the phone and say, hey, I'm confused. Can we talk about it? You are linearly dealing with this. So it all goes back to different versions of clarification, which I asked for there. Let's do a deeper dive into like Dr. Rapp said, when we are identifying the real issues behind the objections, like you said, We have unclear value or risk, back to that slide going from needs to alternatives to risk. There's a lack of urgency or there's competition. One of the people asked, one of the questions was, "Hey, we already have somebody for that," and that's probably in a early on in the prospecting. I mean, that's where you challenge, say, certainly they're probably doing a really good job for you. Would you be open to some alternatives, or at least at the same time keeping them true? So when the time is right, you at least are open to different options. You got to be fast and not challenge what they're doing. And then Chip, I think asked another question: is there any research or resource on the types of objections? I'm going to make it real simple for you. There's a lot of research out there for the types of objections, but they're typically around product scope. They're typically around delivery. They're around value price. There's budget objections, right? And then you got timing in there. So they're your six bigs, right? And then the category inside there's another category. Are they half-baked objections? Are they real objections? Are they an objection of credibility? So like you got to actually put a heat map on those objections. That's why putting it in, just dealing with it in writing doesn't allow you as the salesperson to put it in category and actually really deal with the momentum. And remember, sending's not selling. So, and you diagnose, like Dr. Rabb said, prior to objections. Let's get into negotiation when a deal's ready for negotiation. So think about it this way: when you start negotiating, you've agreed to some level in principle that you're probably going to do business with each other. Now it's a matter of negotiating the finer points. Now, as you negotiate, there may be some things you can't do, and they say no. I was coaching an exec today on he's recruiting a potential VP, and there was four asks in a offer back from the recruited person. One was comp, one was what they managed, another was signing bonus and something else. And what I don't think the company's going to be able to deal with the comp. So then he's going to have to weigh out, are three of the four enough, right? And if they can't overcome that one thing, even though they've agreed in principle, that he might not be able to negotiate it, or the candidate might not be able to negotiate it, right? So recognizing true buying signals: is the buyer aligned to the problem or solution? Do we have some kind of agreement in principle? Are they engaged? Am I negotiating against ourselves? Right? I usually look for somebody to counter their first offer. I try never to counter their offer. I usually wait. Right? Is the value understood? And you're shifting from if to how. Right? So as we go down this a little bit, I'm going to have Dr. Rapp kind of talk about the negotiation process. This is where you really start to, especially with longer deals, you start really looking at negotiation as a process, right? You're coming off those objections. So, Doctor, I'm going to hand it over to you for a sec here.
Sure. So, negotiation process, you mentioned early on today in the webinar, right? A structured, repeatable process, right? We need it for sales. We need it for negotiation. We know that in sales, organizations that have a structured sales process, that they achieve goals 20% higher. Same thing with negotiation. When it comes down to it, the first part is positioning, right? It's everything that we've done prior to get to this point. The more value we built earlier on, and I know that I'm harping on this, the more value that we built earlier on, the easier this negotiation process becomes. Okay. Because this is happening throughout. We're positioning earlier to then move to this step. Okay. Once we have alignment, Lance brought this up, like when do we start? We have to make sure that we have alignment, and alignment's in a couple different places. Number one, between buyer and seller. Are we aligned on what they're looking for and what we can deliver? If they're still throwing out objections, if they're still giving you challenges, do not start the negotiation process, right? We want to address all the confusion early on before we get to this. Now, once we get to this and you look at it, it seems challenging, but it's not. If you remove the emotion out and realize you're just having a conversation, it's not that difficult. We build the plan, what it's going to look like, preparing beforehand. We never want to walk in blind. We want to understand what we're negotiating on, what our range is on, right? Internally before I start the conversation. And then once a point's come up, I want to clarify, help me understand, right? Ask those questions, dig in a little bit, present where you are with respect to that negotiation and your organization's position on it. And then if you need to bargain, if you need to give, then we negotiate, right? But what's important, and this is where there's all kinds of tips and techniques and tricks we're not going to get into in this webinar, but there's ways to address some of these things, right? Personally, when it comes to me and somebody wants me to negotiate, one of the questions I always ask is, okay, well, if you want something to go away, say price, if you want price to be lowered, then help me understand what part of the deal am I pulling away? Like what piece of the value that I've explained to you are you okay with not getting? Because that starts to pull in the idea, and I don't want to get heavy on theory right now, but this idea of loss aversion. And if we know anything about behavioral economics, people hate to lose stuff. So if I built a really nice list of value earlier on in our presentation, our interaction, when we get to here and Lance says, price needs to drop, help me understand, right? What's your number? We talk about that a little bit, say, okay, well, if price is going to go, then some of these other pieces need to go with it. Then all of a sudden people start to become a little more hesitant, right? But this is a simple process of going through, coming in prepared. Once the issue comes up, clarify, make sure you get a clean understanding of it before we simply just roll over and give them whatever they want, present our position. And then if we need to bargain, then we see what we bargain on. The idea of, we call it trading equals. If they need a price drop by a significant amount, then what over here is going to give as well. Right? So that's how I take a look at this when I think about the negotiation process.
No, it's really well said. And as you think about this also, if you go back and if you really want it simplistically today, right? Objections, you're agreeing, right? And then there's a resolution. So then we're like, okay, I can deal with that. And then the negotiation is actually the sticking points to get it all the way through. And when you look at the real time to the right, you're doing the same thing in objections that doing what's the same with objections and negotiation is the clarification, which is smoking out the objection, categorizing it, and then presenting. And then the only thing you're adding in is the bargaining. What Adam just said there, if they're asking you for a concession on price, he's saying, okay, what are you going to give me back for that? Because if you go in theory, there's lose win, win lose, or win win. There has to be that win win, right? So then if you give something up and they give nothing up in return, that's extortion. Let me give you a quick example, very quick example. One of our salespeople, Josh, was working with a tech company, and the tech company, in theory, agreed with our plan. And it was a six-figure consulting and training, sales training deal. They said, we just really want to check your references. Can we talk to a few people? Josh immediately said yes. He comes back and he says, look, I got this deal. They just need some references. And I said, well, what do we get for the references? He says, well, we'd get the sale. I said, no, no, no. If we get the sale, they get the training. What do we get for the references? Because I don't know what you mean. I go, you conceded to references. What you should have asked them is, if you hear what you want to hear, we're going to move forward. Is that right? And he goes, Lance, that's something so little. I go, no, that's huge. Because otherwise we're asking our customers to do the work for us. That's the example of like the perfect negotiation. We've agreed, yes, we just need this to confirm. Okay, then if you confirm, we got it. Well, yes, and then you move forward, right? That's that real-time bargaining. But you can't, remember, if you give something up and don't get something in return, that's extortion. And you can't get to bargaining if you're blind, if you haven't done the work like Dr. Rapp said before that. So just as we bring this bird down for a landing, well, about 10 minutes for questions, practical strategies to apply immediately, separate objections from negotiation. No ready, fire, aim. Don't jump to conclusions, right? Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. Use a structured negotiation process. If you don't have one, you're going to have to build one. and you got to build the consistency with objections across in negotiation across your sales team. And I'll just end with this. Um, I was behind me is my two favorite books, All the Places You'll Go and Green Eggs and Ham. And if you have your AI handy or whatever you're using these days, probably Green Eggs and Ham is the best sales book you'll ever read. So if you asked AI, hey, what's how many objections are in the book Green Eggs and Ham? I'd probably tell you around 73 objections. And if you ask yourself, well, what was the objection in Green Eggs and Ham? And who was the salesperson? Well, the salesperson was Sam I am, and the main objection was I don't like green eggs and ham. I don't like them with a box. I don't like them with a fox. But then if you say, what was the first objection? That's interesting. So 72 times it was, I don't like green eggs and ham, but the first objection was the objection of the salesperson. The first objection states, I don't like that Sam I am. Don't be the first objection. With that, we're going to turn it over to some specific questions. So Chip, I'm going to hand it back over to you. And as Chip's coming up with the questions, you can download information about our sales training program, our negotiation program, and our sales negotiation strategy guide. So Chip, we'll hand the conch back to you, my friend.
Excellent. Well done. Great content, everybody. One of the questions was one of the biggest issues we see in negotiating is negotiating too early. How can sales team recognize when a deal is actually ready for negotiation?
You want to take a stab at it, Dr. Rip? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. So I think a big thing is as we're going through this, when we do our presentation, we go through our presentation, we ask the client their thoughts, their feedback, anything they'd like more information on. If the client says, obviously, if they start giving some objections, if they want some more information, then it's important to dig into that. For me, I like to ask, I say, okay, are there any more questions, concerns, any other issues you'd like to discuss? If they say no, then say, okay, well, I would like to move forward with this conversation, right? I would like to make and I make recommendations. I never ask for business because if I've addressed all their issues and they say there's no others, my recommendation is we're going to move forward and here's how we move forward. If something emerges then okay, we're not negotiation phase yet. We're still dealing with objections. Mm-hmm. If nothing else emerges, then say, okay, let's go ahead and move forward with that process. For me, there's a definitive mark in time. And if things start to arise when that negotiation comes up and then they start raising these other issues, then if I need to, I'll take a step back and say, well, let's address this before we get into that negotiation. So if you get into negotiation and they start raising all of these issues, I will take a step back and I will separate those two specifically and purposefully with intent, because I do not want those objections to become anchors in that negotiation. So even if you feel like you're getting a little bit ahead of yourself and you're like, oh, we started too soon, it's okay to take a step back and just say, okay, well, before we continue with negotiation, let's talk about what other issues you might have here.
That's right. That's right. I think the way I'm going to end, so well said, because for all of you here and a lot of you are hanging around, like, sales is not linear. It's actually a circle. And so you're kind of pulling back, you're bringing the puck back per se, right? I think number one, when I ask salespeople and leaders, hey, what's your go-to close? How do you actually close a sale, right? And to get to an objection, most of the time you actually have to close to get to a real objection. Most salespeople don't have a common way they close. The simplest thing I can coach you on right now would just be, based on what we talked about, what's your thoughts on moving forward? What's your opinion on moving forward, right? And they're going to probably say some level, let me think about it, in most complex sales, right? So like Dr. Rapp said earlier, you should be ready for that. It's like going to Topgolf, right? Like you're just teeing up everybody's good at Topgolf because they can just hit the ball from the tee every time, right? So it's a Topgolf thing, which, by the way, they're a good customer of ours, right? So the question then, when they think about it, hey, just out of curiosity, as you think about some things, what do you absolutely love and what do you hate about what we presented? A lot of times, if you think resolve objections before they come up or on your own terms, if they bring it up, you're at risk, okay? So what do you hate, what do you like or not like? What do you hate or love, right? It doesn't matter. And then you start pulling out of them. Then you start resolving the objection that way, and you're asking in addition to that. Then they agree with you in principle. Then you move to negotiation. But if they're still popping off objections, you're not there. And then you start bargaining and giving stuff away. based off of reactions of what they're saying. You are upside down. You are playing slots and not craps at this point. But that goes back to the whole premise today. The whole premise is if you're a salesperson, do I have a predictable, scalable way which I resolve objections? Do I have a process? That's number one. And if you don't, that's an issue. Two, do you put things in categories? You put the objections in categories. As a leader, you should be asking yourself those two questions. Do we have a handling objections process that we teach our salespeople? And do we have an objections process? If you are just looking at these things as skills and characteristics, you are not even halfway there to success. So with that, Chip, unless you have any other questions, I think we're right about our time, unless you have one more.
Yeah, we actually have one more I think we can
Sure.
fit in. How do top performing salespeople establish value early enough so you're not forced to do all the discounting later on?
Let me jump in.
Yep.
So one of the things, obviously, I teach at the university, so I teach a lot of young aspiring sales professionals. I know a lot of folks that have been in the field for quite some time, and the big thing for me is first is realize there's different levels of value. And Lance has heard me say this before. There's the organization, the brand that you work for, they bring a certain level of value. The product or the service that you're selling, there's obviously value tied there. And there's you as the individual. So the reason I bring this up is for the undergraduate students I teach, I say, hey, look, you don't have a lot of individual value because you're brand new. I see people on the call, a good friend of mine, Ali Stalter, who's on the call, right? She's been in sales now for I don't know, 15 years in tech sales. As an individual, she brings a massive amount of individual value. And so when we're starting to bring value on early on, there's different ways to present that. The first thing is in that opening, to Lance's point, if they say, I'm not interested, I don't have enough time for you, we haven't done a good job anchoring on the first piece of value on why they should talk to us. As we're going through, even our questioning can be designed to help value emerge, right? If you're going in with your standard questioning that says, tell me about your business, first of all, please stop, right? It's got to be with purpose and intent because we can start asking more meaningful questions that'll help us arrive at value that we can present. Once we identify the needs and the benefits, let's talk about it. Say, okay, besides that, what else is important to you? What else is on your wish list? If there's things that you're looking for, working with a vendor for a service, whatever, what are the other things that matter to you? And as they talk about those, they might not be front and center for them, but those are the ways we can present value, and that's how we differentiate from the competition.
I'm going to steal one out of your playbook, one liner, so we can land this. The salespeople that personalize the sale, it's not about customization, it's about personalization.
That's it.
And the more you do that as a seller and you become interested in them and think of a equilateral triangle, your ability to build rapport, your ability to establish credibility, and your ability to show understanding of the buyer from your brand, personal brand to theirs, not about your business brand. That's the stuff early and putting the time into it. So Dr. Rapp, appreciate your time. Chip,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Great webinar. Such a hot topic. If anyone wants to download our sales negotiation training program, click on the QR code to learn more about that, or the resource here for sales negotiation strategy guide. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and you'll get a recording of this following this webinar. Thank you.